Can a president ever be above the law? In courtrooms across the globe, justice answered with a resounding no. These 6 leaders once ruled with power and pride until the truth caught up. From embezzlement and bribery to abuse of power and espionage, this is how their legacies collapsed, one conviction at a time. Today, we uncover the true crime stories of political giants brought down by their own actions and the justice systems that dared to prosecute them. Case 1. Jacob Zuma, South Africa. It began with a man whose life mirrored the story of a nation. Born into poverty in rural KwaZulu-Natal, Jacob Zuma had no formal schooling and herded cattle as a boy. But in the fires of apartheid South Africa, he forged a new identity, one of defiance, of struggle, of purpose. He joined the African National Congress and quickly rose through the ranks of the liberation movement. He spent 10 years as a political prisoner on Robben Island. Later, he became head of intelligence for the ANC during the dark days of exile. By the time South Africa became a democracy, Zuma was already a seasoned operator, trusted, charismatic, and dangerous to underestimate. In 2009, Jacob Zuma became the 4th president of democratic South Africa. To many, it felt like justice fulfilled. A man of the people had risen from nothing to lead the most powerful office in the country. His supporters adored him, drawn to his charm, his Zulu pride, his populist touch. He danced at rallies. He sang liberation songs. He promised jobs, land reform, and dignity. He was their masholozi. But beneath the celebration, cracks began to show. They started as quiet investigations, leaked memos, unexpected resignations. And then came the names, the Gupta brothers, businessmen with inexplicable access to state contracts who appeared to have a private line to the president's inner circle. Deals were being signed, officials reshuffled, ministries hollowed out, all seemingly at the whim of unelected outsiders. It wasn't just corruption. It was something deeper, more systematic. A phrase emerged, state capture. Not bribery in the traditional sense, but the repurposing of the entire machinery of the state for private gain. By the time the Zondo Commission was established to investigate, the evidence was mounting. Testimonies from former cabinet ministers, leaked emails, financial trails, all pointing toward a vast, coordinated abuse of power. And at the center of the storm, Jacob Zuma. When the commission summoned Zuma to testify, many believed this was the moment of truth. But he refused. Again and again. He cited bias. He claimed persecution. He walked out of hearings and eventually stopped showing up altogether. The Constitutional Court, South Africa's highest legal authority, ordered him to appear. Still, he refused. And then the hammer fell. In June 2021, Jacob Zuma was found guilty of contempt of court. The sentence, 15 months in prison. It was a staggering moment in the country's democratic journey, the first time a former president had been sent to jail. Some called it accountability, others, a political hit. But when Zuma handed himself in, the country did not sigh with relief. Instead, it caught fire. Protests erupted in KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng. Roads were blocked, stores looted, warehouses torched. Over 350 people lost their lives in the unrest. What began as a legal consequence for defying the courts had become one of the deadliest uprisings since the end of apartheid. To this day, South Africa remains divided over Zuma's legacy. To his defenders, he remains a victim of elite conspiracy, a man punished for being too close to the ground. To his critics, he is the architect of a lost decade, a leader who betrayed his oath, weakened institutions, and nearly broke the republic. Case 2. Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, Brazil. He was born into hunger, raised in the heat of Brazil's industrial backbone, and forged in the furnaces of labor. Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, known simply as Lula, was never meant to lead a nation. His childhood was marked by poverty so deep that he shined shoes to survive and dropped out of school in the 5th grade. But somewhere between factory shifts and union meetings, a different path emerged, one not paved by privilege or elite education, but by grit, charisma, and the ability to inspire crowds in the streets. By 2003, he had made history, becoming Brazil's first working-class president. The poor called him hope. The rich called him dangerous. But Lula delivered. Under his presidency, millions were lifted from poverty. Hunger declined. Brazil's global standing rose. His speeches echoed through favelas and foreign capitals alike. He was the man who had come from nothing and given the forgotten a seat at the table. But what happens when the face of progress is accused of betrayal? In 2014, the ground began to shake. A massive investigation, codenamed Operation Car Wash, was uncovering a vast corruption scheme at the state oil company, Petrobras. Billions in bribes, contracts inflated, politicians bought and sold. As the web widened, one name shocked the nation: Lula. Prosecutors alleged that Lula had received a luxury beachfront apartment, complete with a private elevator and designer renovations, from a construction company in exchange for political favors. He denied it all. He said the apartment wasn't his. He called it a political attack. But the court wasn't swayed. In 2018, he was sentenced to more than 12 years in prison for corruption and money laundering. Imagine this: a man once ranked as the most popular president in Brazilian history, now behind bars. His supporters wept. His opponents celebrated. And Lula, unbowed, watched the 2018 presidential election unfold from a cell in Curitiba. Was this justice or retribution? He served 580 days before the tides turned again. In 2019, Brazil's Supreme Court ruled that Lula's imprisonment had violated due process. The court declared that he had been denied the right to a fair and impartial trial. His conviction was annulled. His political rights were restored. And then, against every political odd, media prediction, and personal insult, he did the unthinkable. In 2022, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva ran for president once more, and he won. From prisoner to president, from disgrace to redemption. The world had watched as Lula fell, but few could have predicted that he would rise again. So the question remains: was he a victim of lawfare, a political trial disguised as justice, or was it the ultimate comeback from a man who never stopped fighting? What does it mean when the justice system convicts a former president, only for that same system to reverse itself years later? And what does it say about a democracy when its most powerful figure can return from prison to power? Case 3. Alberto Fujimori, Peru. He was the outsider no one saw coming, a mathematics professor turned dark horse candidate who rose to power in Peru almost by accident. In 1990, while the nation was crippled by hyperinflation, terrorism, and a political class the people no longer trusted, Alberto Fujimori emerged not as a symbol of hope, but as a calculated alternative. He was calm, he was firm, and most importantly, he was different. But once in office, that difference took on a more dangerous form. Just 2 years into his presidency, Fujimori stunned the world. On April 5, 1992, he staged what became known as an auto-gulp, a self-coup. He dissolved Peru's Congress, suspended the Constitution, and took control of the judiciary. Tanks rolled into Lima. Critics were silenced. Supporters claimed it was necessary to end chaos. But what happens when a democracy is shut down with applause? To many, Fujimori was the man who got things done. He crushed inflation. he stabilized the economy. And most visibly, he led a brutal campaign to defeat the Shining Path, a Maoist guerrilla group classified as a terrorist organization responsible for thousands of civilian deaths. But behind the triumphs was a hidden war, one fought not only against terrorists, but against innocent civilians. According to court records and human rights investigations, Fujimori authorized the creation and operation of Grupo Colina, a clandestine death squad embedded within the military. Their mission was simple: eliminate enemies of the state. But in their path fell students, professors, and civilians, people with no proven ties to insurgents. Among the most haunting cases was the Barrios Altos massacre, where 15 people, including an 8-year-old child, were gunned down at a neighborhood barbecue. Then came La Cantuta, 9 students and a professor abducted and executed, their bodies later buried in a shallow grave. And still, that wasn't the end of it. In parallel to the bloodshed, Fujimori's regime was bleeding the state dry. Tens of millions were siphoned from Peru's treasury, redirected into intelligence slush funds, personal expenses, and payments to his infamous spy chief, Vladimiro Montesinos, whose hidden videos of bribes and blackmail would eventually bring the empire crashing down. By 2000, with scandals erupting and opposition mounting, Fujimori fled to Japan, sending his resignation by fax. But the story wasn't over. In 2005, he made the baffling decision to fly to Chile, perhaps hoping to stage a political return. Instead, he was arrested and extradited to Peru, where justice had been waiting. In 2007, Alberto Fujimori became the first democratically elected head of state in Latin America to be convicted and imprisoned for human rights violations. The verdict was historic: 25 years in prison for murder, kidnapping, and corruption. For over a decade, he remained behind bars. But in 2023, a frail and aging Fujimori walked free, released on humanitarian grounds, a decision that reignited fierce debate across Peru. Was it compassion or impunity? Case 4. Park Geun-hye, South Korea. She was born into power, the daughter of Park Chung-hee, South Korea's military strongman who ruled with an iron grip for 18 years. Park Geun-hye grew up in the Blue House, the presidential palace. But while her childhood was shaped by protocol and political ceremony, it was also scarred by violence. First, the assassination of her mother by a North Korean sympathizer in 1974. Then, 5 years later, the assassination of her father by his own intelligence chief. She was only 27 when she left the Blue House, and nearly 4 decades later, she would return, not as a daughter, but as its master. In 2013, Park Geun-hye made history, becoming the first female president of South Korea. Her campaign promised integrity, stability, and a leadership that would rise above factional politics. Millions believed her. Her image, reserved, stoic, and dignified, evoked strength and tradition. But who was really pulling the strings? By 2016, whispers became headlines. Leaked documents revealed that Park's longtime confidant, Choi Soon-sil, a woman with no official government position, no clearance, and no accountability, had been editing speeches, influencing appointments, and guiding national policy from behind the scenes. Choi had even used her influence to coerce major South Korean conglomerates, Samsung among them, into donating millions to her private foundations. Was Park merely complicit? Or had she allowed her friend to govern by proxy? What followed was nothing short of a national rupture. As news spread, millions of South Koreans flooded the streets, waving candles and chanting in unison, "Step down." The nation was gripped by a crisis of trust. Night after night, protests engulfed Seoul. The people demanded answers and accountability. And in December 2016, the National Assembly acted. Park Geun-hye was impeached, an unprecedented fall for a sitting president in one of Asia's most robust democracies. The Constitutional Court upheld the decision. She was removed from office in March 2017. Then came the trial. In 2018, Park was convicted of abuse of power, coercion, and bribery. The charges detailed how she and Choi had pressured companies for donations, awarded favors, and subverted the constitution she had sworn to uphold. The sentence, 24 years in prison. And later, with additional charges, that became 32 years. A president, once the symbol of South Korea's democratic maturity, now confined to a cell. But the story didn't end there. In 2021, after serving nearly 5 years, Park was granted a presidential pardon, not because she was exonerated, but due to her declining health. The government cited national unity. Critics saw political calculation. Case 5. Mohamed Morsi, Egypt. He stood at the podium in June 2012, arms raised, declaring victory not just for himself, but for the revolution. Mohamed Morsi, a mild-mannered professor with a PhD in engineering from the University of Southern California, had just been elected Egypt's first civilian, democratically elected president. For a nation reeling from the collapse of Hosni Mubarak's 3-decade rule, Morsi's ascent seemed to mark the beginning of a new chapter. But in the shadows of celebration, questions began to rise. Morsi was not just any candidate. He was the backup, the Muslim Brotherhood's second choice after their original nominee was disqualified. A man who once described himself as the spare tire. But that spare tire soon gripped the steering wheel of a country desperate for stability, justice, and change. He took office on the promise of pluralism. Yet, within months, his leadership took a turn that many saw as authoritarian. In late 2012, he issued a controversial constitutional decree, granting himself sweeping powers immune from judicial review. He insisted it was temporary, meant to protect the revolution. But to many, it felt like the return of the very autocracy the people had risen to dismantle. The streets filled again, not with hope, but with fury. Millions marched. Clashes erupted. The fragile trust that had ushered Morsi into power began to collapse. And then came July 3, 2013. Tanks rolled into Cairo. Military leaders, led by General Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, removed Morsi from power and placed him under arrest. The brief experiment with democratic rule was over. What followed was a maze of trials. In courtroom after courtroom, Morsi faced charges of espionage, inciting violence, and leaking state secrets, not just to local factions, but to foreign powers, including Qatar and Hamas. One court handed him a 20-year sentence. Another imposed a life sentence, and yet another sentenced him to death, a verdict later overturned on appeal. The accusations were complex. The evidence, at times, contested. But the message was clear. Egypt's post-revolution order was being rewritten. Throughout his imprisonment, Morsi was held in near total isolation. Reports from international watchdogs and his family described a deteriorating state of health, limited access to medical care, and near-zero communication with the outside world. His conditions, they said, amounted to slow-motion execution. Then, in June 2019, during a court appearance, Morsi collapsed inside the courtroom. He died minutes later, clutching the stand where he had once tried to defend his presidency. The official cause: a heart attack. But human rights organizations, including the United Nations, pointed to something deeper: a pattern of neglect, isolation, and psychological abuse. Case 6. Omar al-Bashir, Sudan. In 1989, a little-known brigadier general marched into the heart of Khartoum, seizing power in a bloodless coup that overthrew Sudan's fragile democracy, and from that moment on, Omar al-Bashir became a name etched into the bones of a nation. For 30 years, he ruled with a mixture of calculated repression, brutal security forces, and carefully managed chaos, presenting himself as a stabilizing force in a country scarred by division. But what the world would later uncover was that stability came at the cost of lives, hundreds of thousands of them. Behind the sharp uniforms, televised speeches, and promises of Islamic governance, a darker truth unfolded in the western region of Darfur. Beginning in 2003, under al-Bashir's command, the Sudanese military and the government-backed Janjaweed militias launched a campaign of slaughter, displacement, and terror against ethnic African communities. Entire villages were burned to ash. Civilians were raped, killed, or driven into refugee camps that sprawled across Sudan and neighboring Chad. The world watched, and eventually, the world acted. In 2009, for the first time in its history, the International Criminal Court, ICC, issued an arrest warrant for a sitting head of state, charging Omar al-Bashir with war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Accusations tied directly to the deaths of over 300,000 people in Darfur. The warrants shook diplomatic norms. Al-Bashir shrugged them off. He traveled internationally, taunting the court, landing in countries that refused to hand him over. He smiled for photo ops and stood beside world leaders as the weight of genocide hung invisibly over his shoulders. How could a man wanted for extermination on a mass scale remain untouchable? The answer lay in power, loyalty, and the complicated chessboard of international law. But even power built on fear is not eternal. In 2019, amid rising food prices, inflation, and public exhaustion, the streets of Sudan erupted. Mass protests, led by women, students, and doctors, filled the city squares. The chants echoed louder than the bullets. After months of defiance, the military turned on its old general, placing him under arrest and ending his 30-year reign. And for the first time, Omar al-Bashir stood before a Sudanese court, not for genocide, but for corruption. The charges seemed minor compared to what he had been accused of internationally, but symbolically, it was a crack in his armor. He was convicted in 2019 and sentenced to 2 years in a reform facility, citing his age. It wasn't justice for Darfur, but it was the first time he saw the inside of a cell. Then came the question that Sudan, and the world, still wrestles with. Will Omar al-Bashir be extradited to face the ICC? The new transitional government promised cooperation. Hopes were raised. But years passed. Political instability, coups, and armed conflict have delayed the process. As of today, he remains in custody in Sudan, his future uncertain, his trial for the gravest of crimes, genocide, still pending. If you found this journey through truth and power compelling, don't let the story end here. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more gripping, real-life political crime stories from around the world. Your support helps us bring these hidden chapters to light, and together, we make sure these stories are never forgotten.